Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Demai, Chapter 2, Halacha 4. In the art scroll, we're on 21a1. This will be a two-part shiur because it's going to be 2 pages. So, we were covering in Chapter 2, Halacha 1 about somebody who wants to be a chaver. They're not allowed to sell produce unless they're tithing. And the seller's obligation to tithe the Demai that he sells does not apply to all cases. This, by the way, also comes up in Chapter 2, Halacha 2. So, how is this going to work, right? So, when is it going to be where you're going to be forbidden to sell, as we learned over there in the Mishnah? And when is it going to be where there can be some commerce going on? And how's all of this going to get put together? And strictly speaking, it's always going to be the buyer's responsibility to separate out the tithes, since he's the one who's going to be eating it. And it's his food. So in regards to tevel, the rabbis are ruling that the seller must separate the tithes before selling it, in order to make sure the buyer's not accidentally buying and eating untithed food. Eating untithed food is very serious. But for Demai, the rabbis are more lenient. And by the way, if we went to a Doraita situation about this, where it's going to be law in the land and this is going to be Doraita, then it's not going to be lenient. It's not going to be Demai, and they're just going to rule that the seller is going to have to tithe this to make sure that nobody's eating untithed foods. And you see that a lot today. When you go up to the orchards in the north, they're separating out the tithes, and there's a hechsher for it, and there's kashrus and supervision, and you don't have to worry about eating tevel. So it's going to be the same thing in the future. And over here, they're going to talk about the different cases where there's going to be different responsibilities for separating out these Demai tithes. So the Mishnah starts off and says, regarding a commercial baker, the sages required them to separate from their bread only a quantity sufficient for trumos and maaseros and challah, but they did not require them to separate maaser sheni. Now, there's always going to be a special case with commercial bakers for just all sorts of halachot. One of the things for them is that when they're separating out challah, they can do a much smaller size than a private baker. Why is that? Because they're doing such a big volume that it ends up being a significant amount, even though they'll take out like 1/48th, and a private person will take out 1/24th. That 1/48th ends up being a gigantic amount when you're cooking bread for a whole city. So over here, let's talk about the differences between separation of trumos, maaseros, and challah, but they're not required to separate maaser sheni. So the Rosh is saying about this in his commentary on the Mishnah. He's saying that this Mishnah is referring to chaver bakers who purchased grain from Amoratzim suppliers. And since this bread is demai, because it's not known whether the supplier tithed the grain, the rabbis are lenient and did not require the baker to separate maaser sheni before selling the product. And the Rosh is saying further that the Mishnah's ruling is directed specifically at chaver bakers, even though certainly Amoratzim bakers, Amoritz bakers, must also separate the tithes before selling the product. And that's going to be because the Amoritz would not listen or pay heed to the Demai tithing requirement. So I want to talk about a little bit for why we have this leniency. So the reason for this leniency for bakers is actually not listed in the Yerushalmi, but this leniency does get explained in the Bavli in Yoma 9a. And if we look in the Bavli, it's going to say and explain, and we're pulling from the Rambam commentary on it, that in the Mishnaic times, market superintendents appointed by the government would coerce commercial bakers into having very, very artificially low prices. And the effects of these artificial price controls would hit the baker's profit margin, and it would be very severe. So to avoid burdening the bakers with a requirement to transport the maaser sheni of the bread to Jerusalem, the sages exempted the bakers from separating the maaser sheni from their Demai product, and instead transferred the obligation to the purchaser. And then the bakers are left only with the responsibility to separate trumos, maestros, and challah. So that's going to be the historical reason why. And this is not actually given in the Yerushalmi, it's actually given in the Bavli. Anyway, there's going to be additional requirements for the seller's responsibility to tithe his Demai merchandise. Now, we're talking about here for all food dealers. We're not just talking now about bakers. Just want to point that out. So the Mishnah continues and says, retail shopkeepers who sell in small quantities are not allowed to sell Demai. And this, by the way, looks a lot like what we were learning earlier in chapter 2, that people you're not really supposed to be doing business with this stuff. So the Mishnah continues and says, but all those who sell with a large quantity all at once are permitted to sell Demai. These are really like wholesalers. So retail shopkeepers who sell very small quantities of food at any one time, they're going to be required to separate even the maaser sheni, while people who sell very, very large quantities, says Rabbi Kanievsky from his Beur shiurim, are going to be exempt from separating even trumos maaser. And the Gemara is going to actually explain that, and it's also going to define what is a large measure. So that explanation is coming up in the Gemara. But it's very important to know this distinction from the Mishnah, that if you're doing business in small quantities, you're not permitted to sell Demai, but if you're a wholesaler doing large volume, you are. And the Mishnah continues, says, and who are considered people who sell with large measure, for example, wholesalers and sellers of grain. So these are talking about professional wholesalers, and this is not talking about a private individual who happened to buy some produce from an Amaretz and he's now trying to sell in a large quantity. This, by the way, gets back to what we covered in Shvius, who is going to be really covered as a businessman when we're worried about Shvius produce. And so over there in Masechet Shvius, I believe it's in chapter 6, it gives a list of who is allowed to. No, it's not chapter 6. It gives over there a list of criteria for, I believe it's chapter 5, for doing business with large volumes, and the people who are going to be doing business with small volumes. Now, over there in Shvius, if you're doing business, it's actually going to be the reverse case. So if you're doing business in very, very small quantities and small volumes, and you're not really set up as a professional, and that's not really your business, you can sell your leftover Shvius produce, and you can use that money to use for help in your house, like to buy more olive oil for Shabbat, or for wine for Shabbat, things like that, to help for your lifestyle, for your maintenance, for doing like the avoda, like so you can get some meat for Shabbat, things like that. But when you get to be a big businessman and you're doing big quantities of volume on a daily basis, then you're forbidden. So over here, we're also talking about who's going to be considered somebody who's doing sales with like large measures. And I think that it's going to be very similar as what we saw over there in Shvius. Now the Gemara is going to continue, and the Mishnah is ruling that a baker has to separate out Trumas maaser and challah, and the Gemara is going to cite another Mishnah that seems to contradict this ruling. So we learned in a Mishnah over there, in the 5th chapter, this, by the way, is going to be over here in Demai 5:1, and it says, one who buys bread from a baker, how does he tithe it? And basically what this is pointing out is that he marks off a quantity enough for the trumos, maaser, and challah. Now, that's very curious because it looks like, isn't the professional baker supposed to separate these tithes out? So why are you now putting this burden onto the consumer? So we're going to get an answer for that. So the Gemara continues and says, here in the 5th chapter, you say the purchaser separates the tithes. Whereas here in this Mishnah, you say the baker separates the tithes. So, it looks like these two Mishnahs contradict each other as to who's going to end up separating out the trumas maaser and the challah. This Mishnah says it's going to be the baker's job. And over there in the Mishnah in chapter 5, here in Demai, it's going to look like it's the customers. So what's the difference? So the Gemara is going to answer and point out. And by the way, one of the things that you want to do when you're learning Gemara is you want to get your head into understanding and resolving these quote-unquote contradictions between Mishnahs, because they're really not. They're really trying to teach different aspects of the law. So the Gemara is now going to talk about the difference between this Mishnah on who's going to separate out the tithes, whether it's going to be the baker or the purchaser. And the Gemara continues and says, Rabbi Yonah says that Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Yochanan disagree regarding the resolution of this contradiction. One says, here our Mishnah, the Tana deals with the baker who makes his bread in a state of Tara. And we were covering that in chapter 2, Halacha 3. And the Gemara continues, says, while here in the 5th chapter, the Tana deals with the baker who bakes bread in a state of Tuma. So the one who says here, our Mishnah's, the Tana is talking about the baker who sells a small measure, whereas in the 5th chapter, the Tana is talking about the baker who deals with a large measure. So I just want to point out that the case of this Mishnah is talking about where the baker purchased from the Amaret's grain that had not become susceptible to Tuma, so it never became wet after it was detached from the ground, and the Amaret's protected it from becoming wet. And then the baker knows that the grain did not become wet because the Amaret's told him it never became wet. So even though the Amaret's is not trusted on tithes, he is trusted if it became wet or not. He's not trusted that if it did become wet, you're not allowed to trust him that it's going to be tamei or tahor because he's not qualified to make that declaration. But he is qualified to say it became wet or it did not become wet. Now, the baker then, in this case, is going to be processing this grain that never became wet into bread. And he's doing that in a state of tahara, which means that he's doing it where everything is going to be pure and tahor. And since the trumos maaser and the challah that were going to be separated from the bread, these are going to be eligible to be eaten by the Goan. Why? Because the Goan can get them and collect them in a state of being tahor. And the sages are going to be obligating the baker, in this case, to separate it. Why? Because it lowers the amount of time and chance that this dough could possibly become tamei. And that's why this is going to be dealing with a baker who's baking in a state of tahara, whereas chapter 5 is going to be dealing with a state of tuma. So over there, they're dealing with a state of tuma because the baker, he's not supposed to come and separate out the the tithes and doing it to make it contaminated. So the Chazan Ish is suggesting that the rabbis are forbidden selling tevel to a chaver only to avoid mishaps, and accordingly the rabbis are trying to free up sellers of large quantities of merchandise of the responsibility of separating maaser, and they excluded them also from selling challah. And why is all of this happening? So over there in the 5th chapter, we're talking about a baker who purchased grain from the Am Haaretz. It became wet, and it could become Demai. And since the Trumas, Maaser, and Challah that would be separated from the bread would be Demai, and it's forbidden for consumption by a Goan, the sages are not burdening the baker with having to separate these gifts, and instead he left it to the customer to do, because he's the one who's going to be eating the bread. Now, the Truma Maaser, this is going to be the responsibility to still be given to the Goan. But the basically the tithing is going to be left to the customer who's going to be eating the bread. So Rabbi Yonah is going to continue with this, and he's going to say, but we do not know who said this and who said that. In other words, which Amorah stated which answer. And the Gemara continues, says, however, based on that which Rabbi Yochanan said, it is because of Taharos and the Taharos consideration that the Mishnah in the 2nd chapter rules that the baker separates the Trumas Maaser and Challah. So the Gemara continues and says, conclude that Rabbi Elazar is the one who said that here in our Mishnah, the Tana speaks of a baker who sells in a small measure, whereas there in chapter 5, the Tana is speaking about a baker who sells in a large measure. So again, we're getting back to two different issues. One is going to be somebody who's selling in a small measure versus a large measure, who said what, and also, was this done in a state of tahara or not? And I want to point out that it would look like even Rabbi Yochanan would admit that a baker who sells in a large quantity at a time is going to be exempt from tithing on this, according to this rule based on Torah. And the reason that Rabbi Yochanan did not give Rabbi Elazar's answer is that he preferred to explain the Mishnah in the 5th chapter to be discussing a baker who also sells in small quantities. So it's possible that Rabbi Yochanan inferred from the Mishnah that the leniency for sellers for large quantities at a time not to tithe their goods applies only to dealers, not to bakers. And that's going to be the insight by the Chazan Ish to explain this. So we're dealing with a small baker who might be dealing in product that is Demai, or we might be dealing with a large baker that might be dealing in product that is Demai. And the question is, who's going to be separating this when it's going to be Demai? Are we going to leave this to the customer or not? So the Gemara is going to ask a question. It's going to say, but there is a difficulty with Rabbi Yochanan's answer. And it says, if our Mishnah speaks of where the baker makes the bread in a state of tahara, the baker should have to separate everything, even maaser sheni. Now again, since the bread is tahor, the baker, rather than the customer, should have to separate the maaser sheni. Why? To lower the possibility that the maaser sheni should become Demai. There's also a requirement to keep that also in a state of tahara. So the Gemara is going to answer. It's going to say, by rights, the baker should not have to separate everything, even the Trumas Maaser and the Challah, because the Mishnah is talking about a seller, discussing selling to a chaver who can be relied upon to separate the tithes himself. And he knows how to separate out the tithes. And, we have a set of Mishnahs laying out criteria on who can be a chaver. So the Gemara continues, says, for the law is that even definite tevel, which one might have thought an Am Haaretz could be relied on to tithe, may not be sold to an Am Haaretz. So the idea here is that certainly he can't, he may not, it might not be sold Demai. And why? Because he's going to be even more relaxed on this. So since the Mishnah is talking about selling to a chaver, it's really the customer who should be required to separate all the tithes. And in practice, the rabbis did not require the baker to separate trumos, maaser, and challah. They did not require him to separate also maaser sheni. They left that to the customer. And the Rosh Cirilio explains about this, that basically bakers should not be required to separate any of the gifts, and therefore, even though the sages did not require them to separate trumos, even though the sages did require them to separate trumos, maaser, and trumos, maaser, challah, they did not obligate them in maaser sheni. And this is from the fact that the baker's profit was severely cut off by the government. And the sages declared that maaser sheni, which, by the way, is the biggest gift of all to separate, should be the responsibility of the chaver buyer. And the Vilna Goan is going to look at this answer a little bit differently. He's going to be saying, according to his reading of the Gemara, he's going to say, by rights, the baker should not be required to separate anything, even trumos, maaser, and challah. Nevertheless, the rabbis did not entrust tahor demai to an am haaretz, and that's going to go to a chaver to separate. And instead, they required the seller to separate the tithes so that they could be separated in Torah. But in the case of maaser sheni, the rabbis were lenient with the baker because they were being harassed by government price regulations. They did not impose the stringency. So one of the concerns here is that if you're the chaver baker, and now you have a Demai, you have a customer who might not be separating out Demai tithes and is not really going to be careful about Demai and tahor, well, then he might just go and contaminate things. So if you're leaving it for him to separate tithes, he's gonna contaminate it because he's an am haaretz. He doesn't know any better, and he's not going to know how to do it. He's not going to know how to treat it. And am haaretzim are always assumed to be impure anyway. They don't know how to keep themselves in a state of purity. So one of the points of just leaving it to the baker to separate is going to be that, okay, well, the Kohanim know who to go to, and they know it'll be kept in a state of Torah. Whereas if they have to go out to the am haaretz to go collect the trumas, maaser, and the challah, which are the gifts to the Kohen, then it's going to be done. It's they're just all they're going to be doing is getting firewood. They're just going to be getting something to feed to the fire because that's what Kohanim do with something that's tamei. And also, it's not nice to make holy food tamei. So the Gemara now is going to turn to the answer of Rabbi Elazar. It's going to ask, but there's a difficulty with Rabbi Elazar's position. And it says, if our Mishnah speaks of a baker who sells with a small measure, and therefore the sages are obligating him to separate trumos, maaser, and challah, the bakers should have to separate everything, even maaser sheni. And the Gemara does not give an answer to the question because the same answer could be given for Rabbi Yochanan's response as well. Anyway, what this is trying to get at is that in the end, this is how the sages set it up. The sages set it up where somebody has to separate this out. Are you going to leave it to the baker to separate it, or are you going to leave it to the customer to separate it? And they're saying that, look, specifically the gifts that go to the Kohen are at a higher level in terms of purity, in terms of holiness, than the maaser sheni anyway. Yes, the maaser sheni has to be kept in a state of Torah, but it's more serious to make the trumas maaser or the challah tamei. And the idea is that if you're keeping the chaver baker with the responsibility to do it, then he's going to already know how to keep it tamei better than the average customer who might be an Amaretz. And then the next issue is going to be, well, what about the maaser sheni? And okay, you have the Bavli issue coming up and saying, fine, let's just leave it because that's the biggest part of the gift, and let's just leave it over to the customer to do. Partially because it's less serious if maaser sheni becomes tamei than trumas maaser, but also why? Because if you have an Amaretz and you have maaser sheni, then the maaser sheni, if the guy ever becomes tamei, he can eat it in a state of it being tamei anyway, and presumably the Amaretz already is tamei anyway, and he separates it out and he makes it tamei, and anyway he can eat it in a state of tuma because it's already going to be tamei. But the Goan can't really do it that way. And so that's another way to look at this. So we're going to continue along in the rest of Chapter 2, Halacha 4, and tomorrow we're going to be getting into shopkeepers and why shopkeepers are not going to be permitted to sell Demai. And then we're going to cover these big wholesalers. So have a great day.